Let's interview you. The Atlanta Historical Society is doing an oral history project of World War II veterans, and your interview will be filed in Atlanta and at the Library of Congress. Start with your name, address, age, and birthday.
Off a minute. I don't know what you. I get ready.
Start with your name, address, age, and birth date. Then your induction into what branch of the military and whether you were enlisted or drafted. What were you doing when you were inducted? And then go on to tell of your military experiences, end with your discharge, and how the military experience changed your life. While you're talking, if either Ann or I have a question, we'll do this. You will have an hour and a half to talk, and I'll wave my hand when only half an hour is left. Be careful not to spend too much time at the beginning so that you have to cut short the end. Today is Friday, September 3rd, 2003, and we are at the home of Harold Yudelson at 3012 Rivermead Drive, Atlanta, Georgia.
30327.
Mr. Yudelson has been a friend of my husband and mine for quite a few years, and we know him well. Would you start taping now?
What I'm telling you, of course, is over 60 years ago, and I'll try and be factual, but sometimes it gets fuzzy, and sometimes I may exaggerate it or remember, when you were a child, sometimes you don't know the truth from what was told you and so forth. But anyhow, I'm going to start before the war. My war started, I think, on Pearl Harbor Day. I was at school. I remember I was going to a fraternity smoker, and a friend of mine, Leonard Kaplan from Macon, came running down the steps and saying we had war. Well, I didn't believe him because we'd had incident after incident. When I got to fraternity house, everybody was gathered around the radio. And of course, we knew then about Pearl Harbor. So we listened. Some of the fellows enlisted the next morning, a few of them. But a friend of mine from Duluth, Minnesota, a fellow named Mort Zalk, a freshman, had a car, which was unusual. So early in the evening, he says, let's go to Washington. And we did. We drove down there, and we couldn't get a hotel room, so we parked across the street from the Capitol, spent the night in the car. No security, nobody bothered us, nobody said a word to us. We spent the night there. We woke up in the morning when it got light, and the Marines were up on the Capitol with machine guns, but they didn't bother us. We drove over to the Senate building and the House building trying to get passes to get in, but we couldn't because the Congress people only got 2 passes each, and we weren't on their priority list. We parked again outside the Capitol, and Roosevelt drove by about 150, 200 feet away. Still nobody bothered us. Of course, they had a lot of security men around him. They were running along and staying on the running board. And we listened on the radio to his speech. This is a day that will live in infamy. We've all heard it, I guess. And we sat there, and then we noticed people coming out. So we went, and we managed to get in just before the vote finished. And if I remember correctly, we heard the one no vote from the Congress lady from Montana. Anyway, we went back to school, and from there until the next school year was pretty much normal. Late in 40, I was 18, and Pearl Harbor was December the 7th, and I was 18 on December the 2nd. So they didn't take 18s. They simply didn't have room to take everybody at the same time. But anyway, about November of 42, the Army sent representatives, and they told us if we would enlist so they had their hands on us, we could finish the semester, which would be the end of February. And my draft board was calling me to report in early December, right after my 19th birthday. But the Army had me then, and they let me stay until February, I think, 22nd. And then they took virtually the entire sophomore class from Penn, and they called us up. We got on trains, went to Fort Meade, Maryland, and there was snow on the ground. I remember my first morning in the Army, they got us up, God knows when, but I couldn't find my socks. I had my shoes on, and we went out in the snow, and they're calling a roll with a flashlight, and I'm looking at the moon through the pine trees, and that's when I knew I wasn't going to like the Army. Anyhow, I had a cousin, Harry Holtz, who had told me earlier, I asked him what the Army was like. He'd been drafted a couple of years older than me. He says, the Army's are just stay out as long as you can. And after I was in a while, I understood what he meant. Anyway, we took the test, and the interviewer recommended that I be assigned to ordnance, or field artillery, quartermaster, so they sent me to the infantry. So I got a break. They send you away from home. I went to Wheeler and Macon, and took my basic training there. I think that's 13 weeks of basic training. My sister Edith was getting married during that time, and fortunately, one of the sergeants training us took his leave in Atlanta, a Jewish fellow, and he knew the family, and he knew my future brother-in-law, and he pulled a few strings, and I got to come home for the wedding. Well, during the basic training, oh, it was so tedious. We used to march in what they call march at attention, where you're supposed to look straight ahead, and I'm looking at the guy's neck in front of me, and if I have to stand this on me a year, I'll go crazy. But after basic training, it was not quite so rigid. Basic training is like being in prison, I think, deliberately, and it was effective. And anyway, they gave us further tests and opened up the ASTP program. The Army, I think, I'm telling you perhaps more than I know, but the Army decided the war may last years and years, and they better send somebody back to college. So I think they had about 300,000 young boys, most of them at some college, and sent us to college. And I went first for reassignment at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and then to Washington, Pennsylvania. And the good news was my father had a chain of stores, and the retail shoe business was like a fraternity. No matter where I went, he knew somebody who knew somebody, some Jewish people. And they were, I always had a Sunday meal if I could get off, or home away from home. Because anywhere we went, the people were most kind to us, you know what I mean. They really wanted to take care of our boys in the service. Well, I stayed in ASTP for 9 months. There were rumors that they might keep some of us in advance, and I wasn't anxious to go back to the infantry. But that's the only time I ever made all A's. And I got a certificate for scholastic excellence and went back to the infantry. And sent us, the whole bunch of us, I want to comment about the infantry. I say, it was interesting because you were with such a different bunch of people. The basic training unit I was in, the company I was in, was basically college boys that had just come in from Penn and Georgetown University, and draftees from Harlan County, Kentucky. Now there's no more Appalachia than Harlan County, Kentucky. And most of these guys were illiterate. I mean, they didn't read, they didn't write. Many of them had never seen a bathroom before, literally. And they used to have to take some of them, so I'd give them a GI shower. They have to take them in the shower and scrub them with a stiff brush to teach them how to take a shower or a bath. But there was one guy in a bunk next to me, Smitty. Shortly after we got there, he woke up with a terrible toothache, and he asked what to do about it. He couldn't read. They went to the company headquarters, and they told him in the morning go sick call. Well, our orientation was different, You hurt, you hurt. So I told him I went back with him, and he says, we'll go to Battalion Aid Station. We went up there. They gave him a few aspirin and sent him back. But the point is, he probably couldn't find the way by himself in this thing. Well, he was my real buddy the whole time we were basic training. Anyway, ASTP closed down, and they sent us to the 84th Infantry, a bunch of us, the 84th Infantry Division. I got a picture of my platoon there. I'll comment on it later. And the interesting thing was the 84th was in its last stages of combat training. It takes about 18 months to create a division, but only takes about 12, 13 weeks to train an infantry man. Of course, you put the staff together from the commanding general who picks the staff right on. And they had stripped the unit of virtually all of its privates, low-ranking people, and sent them over as replacements to replace the casualties from the units in combat. And they didn't take out any of the illiterates. So the boys in the unit that we joined were virtually illiterate. They were Indians from Arizona and New Mexico. And the funny thing about it, when they gave us special training, night map reading problems, for example. They always sent one of these Indians with us to bring us back when we got lost. So that was in, we got there, I think, in February of 44. And I got a break through a little bit of pull. My father had a close friend, Mose Kaplan, who wrote a letter of recommendation. I think he knew the commanding general, who got me an interview for OCS. He didn't get me an OCS, but he got me an interview. And I wanted to be in the engineers, but I didn't know anything, so I flunked that one. And I passed the infantry because I had pretty good infantry training. And I went to infantry OCS probably in June. Well, it was after D-Day, because I remember waking up in the morning. We were living in tar paper shacks, I'll call them. It was miserable in Camp Claiborne. Hot, you know, and anyway, I remember D-Day. We were all relieved because we were ready to go, and the invasion happened before we got there. And I've got a picture of this platoon I left. Everyone in that platoon was a casualty, including me. Everybody in the picture was a casualty. I got the picture. The ones that didn't get hurt from enemy action got trench foot, which was a terrible problem during the cold weather in December and January of the Battle of the Bulge. So I went to OCS, at what we call Benning School for Boys. I was a candidate school at Benning. And I got out, I just saw the thing, I think I got out December the 6th, no, the 12th, December the 12th, and the Battle of the Bulge started December the 18th. Well, normally the Army policy was to give brand new lieutenants 3 months troop duty to get acclimated to being an officer and to learn to handle troops and so forth. We got 3 weeks, and they needed, because, you know, the Battle of the Bulge, they lost 60,000 people right quick. So we went over, went to Meade again as a staging area, and there was an old World War I gray-haired captain who was orienting us, you know, like you get oriented when you start college or something, about the ship and the thing and what we would expect and so forth. And he made one comment I remember well. He says, "Gentlemen, you cannot take any whiskey on the boat with you. The best place to carry it is in your musette bag." So everybody went to Baltimore and talked to the liquor store dealers and to give us what that time we called stoopers, you know. Stoopers were where they stooped down and got you some prize whiskey from under the counter that they didn't put on the shelf. That was true of cigarettes or silk stockings or ketchup or whatever else was scarce. So I remember I got a bottle of Four Roses and a bottle of bourbon and one other. But anyway, we went up to Boston and got on the beautiful, finest ship ever made in this country. I think it was USS Constitution or Independence. And I had a lovely cabin for two, only there were 13 of us in it. But the officer quarters were much nicer, of course. We ate at the table and were served, and the other people, Alvin Greenberg was on the ship with me. And he was so far down the ship, he told me if I gave him a candle, that he was going to desert eating bottom of the ship. But and then this that I was just reading about, it may be of some interest. Every officer was assigned a group of men to be in charge of temporarily while we were over, a group of maybe 30, 40, 50 people. And there was a kid there who had been in Alaska, and he got a German Shepherd dog up there. He managed to keep with him. How, I don't know. He was a private. And he took him in his musette bag, you know, the big bags that we had. I forget the name now. Anyway, and all his friends would take all his clothes and everything, and he'd carry the dog in his bag. Well, we get ready to get on the ship, and I asked this captain, "What are we going to do?" He said, "I don't know anything about the dog. I don't want to know anything about the dog." Kid took the dog on the ship with him. Nobody saw him. Nobody heard him. Anything. And then when we got to Liverpool, or rather we got to well, where was it first? We landed in Scotland, and we got a train, and they were throwing these bags on the dog didn't move. And then when we got to Liverpool, they were throwing, and to across the channel to Le Havre, they had these docks that Churchill had invented, metal docks, and they're throwing these things overboard. And there was a sergeant there working with a British major, and they were taking the personnel records in wooden boxes and lowering them down so they wouldn't tear up. And he took this one bag, duffel bag is the word I'm looking for. And the major looked at it and didn't say anything. I don't know if he knew the dog was in it or not. Anyway, after we got into the replacement system, I lost track of the boy and the dog, but he'd taken that dog from Alaska to the front line. Anyway, so we stayed there for a couple of days in Verviers, Belgium, a temporary camp. We were close enough to the front line, you could see the artillery off in the distance, you know. We weren't supposed to go into town, but we did. Some sergeant to the town, and that's the first time I got drunk. We drank my whiskey, and I drew a double pay the next day because I forgot an allotment, so the next 2 months I didn't get any pay. But we went on the front line, and I remember that pretty vividly. We were going down this sunken road, and the artillery was going overhead, and it's the real thing. Reverting back, I remember one time in training on a really stormy night, the policy was to have a 25-mile hike once a month with full field equipment. And we were going through the woods, and I'm watching the darn lightning reflect on the bayonets, and it would fix bayonets. I don't believe this, you know, it's not me, this is somebody in the movies or something. Anyway, this was the real time, so I got there, and the guy took us first to the regimental commander. He was a full colonel, and he says, this was 1st Infantry Division, you know, the famous Big Red One, and I got in there just by dealing out cards. It was purely random. They didn't pick me, I didn't pick them. I just happened to be assigned to it. And he's sitting in a chateau in a big old room for his office, and he says, gentlemen, this is a regular Army outfit. We expect you to conduct yourself like regular Army officers. That's it. That was his orientation. Then he took us to battalion, where the lieutenant colonel showed us the maps and where we were and who was on our right and who was on our left, and what to expect the next 24, 48 hours. And then we went down to company. And I was the 5th officer in the company. And we got 2 more, that's 7. The regular complement officers is 5 in the company. Of the 7 of us, from March the 1st till May the 8th, 1 finished the war with the company. We had 2 killed, 2 hurt. 1 got malaria, 1 broke a leg, 1 was promoted. Anyway, they got replacements. But of the 7 that were assigned, no 5 while I was there, only 1 managed to survive, so to speak, until the end of the war with that company. And what are you talking about? March, April, May, you know, 3 months. But anyway, they gave me a platoon in the middle of the night in a factory, and he said, you know, I think we're going to be here tonight, so find a place to go to sleep. Everybody's sleeping on this tile floor. And I took off my shoes and used them for a pillow, and a couple hours later, said, okay, let's move out. Well, I didn't know anybody. I couldn't see anybody. I told the sergeant, your platoon, there's nothing I can do till tomorrow. And anyway, we moved out. Another company had went in an attack, and we took their holes. They had foxholes in defense positions. So we stayed there for a day or 2. And things get a little fuzzy. And then we started attacking. And I'll say, you asked about the philosophy and so forth. You know, I had quite a bit of training. I had 3 months at basic, I had 6 months in the division, another 3 months in OCS. I had a year of infantry training, and I thought I was fairly proficient, and I wasn't. But the main thing is you cannot teach young people like us that somebody will kill you if you get a chance. And so psychologically, you know, we always played by the rules, and you could not believe that there are no rules, you know, and we lost a lot of people. I don't know any way to avoid it, but you got careless. You didn't appreciate the fact that you were continuously almost in danger. And the first week or 2, I didn't lose anybody because they used me as reserve. The usual infantry tactics where you had 2 platoons up front and 1 in reserve. And I remember one comment by one of the instructors in OCS, never commit your reserves. I've used that phrase many times. I used it with bankers and I've used it with other people. You mean when you use your reserves, you got nothing left to fall back on, you know. And anyway, after a week or 2, then I got committed, and there were a few incidents in the whole 6 weeks, mostly were hazy. I remember the highlights. I remember some intense moments, and I'll mention some of them. But one thing that struck me very strongly is that there is no change in combat. Day or night, the only difference is light or it's dark. You know, and nothing changes. You eat when you can, you sleep when you can. You're mostly, not mostly, but many times you're literally in a hole in the ground. And you learn after a few weeks a couple of lessons. One, as soon as you can, you dig a hole and crawl in it because that's survival. And the other thing is you become resigned after a few weeks. You're probably going to get hurt. I never thought I'd get killed, but I really, well, the war was so close to over that we thought every day it might end because we tore in March and in April. And I had a platoon, when I got there were about 35 men in it, normal strength, there were about 40, and the casualties began to mount up, and we got replacements. So I had 6 or 8 replacements, and when I left the platoon, we had 22. So you see, I had about 20 casualties in 6 weeks' time. Now, the killed and wounded weren't very high. We had probably 4 or 5 wounded to everyone killed. But the attrition, and what was happening to us was, well, first we were pushing, we were trying to catch them before we got to the Rhine River. And this picture you saw, that's interesting, because we fought into Bonn. I see a telegram from this, I call Uncle Mose Kaplan, who had access to some inside information. He had a telegram telling exactly where I was, you know, but the newspapers told him too. But we were told that, you know, if you get to the river and you get a bridge, cross it. Our company commander said, if you get to the river and see a bridge, blow it up. Who the hell's going to cross a damn bridge? Well, we fought into Bonn, and the city was really in shambles. And we went in at night. You couldn't tell a street from the middle of the street because of the debris and everything. I was going, this is one time that I really almost got hit. We were going around this, down the street, and all of a sudden a machine gun opened up and just missed me. And we ducked into a house, and we went upstairs, and there were 4 or 5 people with me. And I asked, we could see the guy with the machine gun, maybe less than 100 yards away. I said, who's the best shot? And named some guy. I said, hit him. And he did. But then they brought up a tank. They were in this plaza near the Rhine River. There was a park, an open space, and there looked like thousands of Germans. I don't know how many. But they were marching and getting ready to cross them. Apparently they had some transportation across the river. And we went out the back. And that night, then it was getting dark, and I was supposed to be in a certain place, and I wasn't there. Parenthetically, we talk about when you plan the attack. I first got there. We had our maps. They were good maps. They would literally show the houses and the streets and everything. And we'd sit around, and the company commander and the lieutenants, the sergeant who was in charge, we'd draw what we call goose eggs. You put your platoon here, and it'd be a goose egg, and the other platoon is here. We went to make an attack one time when I first got there, and the captain says, you know it won't work, so just go in shooting. That was the orders. And anyhow, I told him, I said, you know, I cannot, it was drizzling, and it was dark, and it was a classic movie version of a war, and the Germans were shooting rockets at us, what we call screaming mimes. It made a lot of noise. And anyhow, and well, give me some machine guns, and I'll take one squad, and we'll attack. Well, the guys come up, I sent a runner back, we got the machine guns, and the sergeant says, Lieutenant, we ain't gonna win the war by ourselves. There's a lot of people out there. They're gonna be gone tomorrow, so I sat down in a cellar on a pile of bricks to decide what to do, and I fell asleep. We hadn't sleep, literally we hadn't slept in about 3 days, you know. Well, I guess it was after midnight at the time, maybe 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. So somebody comes and wakes me up, it's light, and I look out there, and there's some kid coming across there like he's back home, his rifle slung over his shoulder, and there's a German tank out there burned up. It was on the front page of Star. They gave us credit for destroying it, which we didn't. They did it themselves. They couldn't take the tank with them. So that ended the Battle of bond. But I say about getting careless, we went down to this bridge, and probably seen, oh, no, that's not the picture. Anyway, it was blown up, a big bridge. And there was one just like it in Cologne that they had blown up. And some kid, German boy, he must have been 15, 16, gotten shot through the foot. I don't know whether he was hit by us or them. Anyway, we patched him up and sent him back with the medics. But the point is, we were out exposed without thinking that they were right across the river. It was a wide river, but anyhow, we shouldn't have been there. But anyhow, but this kid coming across this plaza says, hey, we got a bridge. Well, Remagen is about 20 miles south of Bonn. And some lieutenant of the 9th, I guess it was 9th Armored Division, they got to that damn bridge, and the Germans had nothing on the other side. The terrain was, well, there was a tunnel, so it was almost mountainous on the other side. You would never have crossed the river at Remagen if you were going to attack, because then you got to scale. And I had vision, in fact, in Bonn, it looked like the Palisades and the Jersey Heights, you know. I could see the German pouring boiling oil on his Latin crusade. But anyhow, this guy took his platoon across that Don Bridge, and they had nothing over there but what we call Volkssturm, the old men Germans that had been drafted there. We ran into a lot of them. I mean, old men, the 50, 60, 70 years old. And they got across without too much problem and held it. And then we started putting everything that we could across the Don River on that bridge. And they took us in trucks down there, and we spent a day or two, about 3 days, I think. And one incident, while we were there, this company commander we had, who really was by that time, he was a battle fatigue case. He had been in North Africa. He had worked himself up from a sergeant to a company commander, a captain. And he'd reached the point where he couldn't light a cigarette. And under stress, he couldn't give an order. I mean, he was a good officer, but he had more than he could take, because of course he had lost hundreds of people, literally, you know, under his command. And they pushed him up to battalion headquarters and made him a staff officer. I guess he recovered all right. I never saw him again. And his assistant, his second command became, he was a really fine guy. He went to, I think, Dartmouth or someplace, and he got killed when I was in the hospital. One of the 2 or 3 people I had any bond with at all, because I was there such a short time. But anyway, when we were in this non-combat situation, our orders were to train these people house fighting. Well, I figured, hell, they knew a lot more than I did. What am I going to teach them anyhow? Because we had a lot of new people. So we're sitting around in a bull session. This captain came up, and as we put it in, he bought me a new one. He's supposed to be training these people. He stood me at attention, and we went out and started working again. But the point was how lax you can be. I wasn't trained enough. You know, I wasn't oriented enough. I had one other situation with him at some point, before or after, when we were tacking up a wooded hill, and he wanted this area cleared, and I was taking the men on an easy path sort of around the hill, and he'd send the people up there. You're supposed to go every 5 yards apart, you know, to see if there were anybody up there, any Germans up there. But anyway, he was a good officer. So we crossed the river in boats that, yeah.
Were you aware of the number of casualties?
In our units, yes, yes. But we hadn't had a lot yet. The Navy brought up, it'd been a few, I'll guess, half a dozen maybe. The Navy brought up boats. How the Navy came from on the Rhine River, I don't know. And they took us across. And then that picture, we got off at the foot of the hill, and we went up into the town, and where we were going to spend the night. By then, the bridgehead was about a mile deep. And they'd been there 3 days, and they had very little resistance, and they'd moved pretty good. The infantry had moved. They didn't have much tanks yet, and artillery, but we stayed there, and they assigned a couple of houses to me, my unit. I made the guys all go down the cellar. I went upstairs, and there was a damn feather bed up there. I spent the night in that bed. The Germans fired artillery all night at the time. Every time it hit, I ought to be in the cellar. And it hit these tile roofs, you know, and you'd hear the tile trickle down. And anyway, I spent most of the night up there. And I felt a little guilty with my dirty boots in that pretty bed. Funny how you get programmed. Anyway, so the next day we moved up online, and the problem, the policy was that the politicians and the top brass were concerned, I think rightfully, that Hitler might try and take his elite and his SS people into the Bavarian Alps and fight us like Afghanistan now forever, you know. So we wanted to cut them off, and we had the opportunity because here we had crossed the river to a place nobody expected us to. The road net was lousy. I mean, it was virtually mountainous. So we walked, and we were attacking 2 and 3 times a day, which was the best thing, because if you gave them a day or two to dig trenches and bring up artillery, you'd be facing much more resistance. Well, we had very little resistance, but the problem is every time you get an order to attack at dawn or even at night, and the chance of somebody's going to get hurt, no matter how little, if they shoot at you at all, the chance of somebody getting hurt. So the attrition was what got us over the next 4 or 5 weeks, and the entire regiment probably had casualties approaching 40 or 50%. And the war's over, for crying out loud. This was already late in March, and I was reading my letters. Every day we expected the Germans to quit, which they didn't. And Hitler apparently, and I read this later, and I may again be telling one of it, he ordered the army to take all the high school kids and give them submachine guns and ambush us, the Americans. And I believe that's what hit me. Anyway, in this incident, during this time, we were told we were going to get a platoon of black soldiers. Now, the Army had virtually no combat black soldiers at the time. They were all running the Red Bull Highway, which was transportation, or they were working in the stevedores and so forth. And we were oriented and worn and everything. Nobody really cared that much, you know. All we wanted was more people. And this was an extra platoon, and the same size goose eggs, the same size area we would have to do, we would have an extra 40 people in a company that was probably down to 120 instead of 180. So they came up, they had a white officer and black sergeants. And I don't know if you saw that letter I wrote to the newspaper about
Yes.
the Georgia flag. I said they were undertrained and over-aggressive. And I had the sense of their male, you know, officers' sense of all of the male. And they were better educated than the average of our enlisted people.
You have a half hour here.
Okay. Okay. But they came up and they took an awful beating. And they got some lousy breaks. One instance, we were going to this town, and there was a curve in the road, and my unit was on the inside of the curve, on the outside of the German tank. Every time they moved from one house to another, they got shot at by the tank. And like I said, they had a lot of casualties. And I told you about the incident where one guy we were with, he got hit in the temple with a small piece of shrapnel, and I patched him up and called the medics, and we crawled up and took him out. They finally picked him up. But we went on, and then we got to Harzburg, Germany, and we were going up into the Harzburg Mountains to clean up, and we got some submachine gun fire from there, and that hit me. And I'll say facetiously, I learned a great lesson on April the 12th, 1945. There's no such thing as an indispensable man, because President Roosevelt died, Lieutenant Yudelson got hurt on the same day, and we won the war anyhow. He had a good vice president, I had a good sergeant. So it went, well, all right. So then I went in the hospital, and there was what I call $1 million wound. I stayed there, and the war ended, and they were going to close the hospital, and I was still limping a little bit, but they sent me back to Czechoslovakia. The whole policy of fraternization, non-fraternization, was unenforceable, you know. But another thing I say, the German people were so obsequious. If they had any, I never heard of any acts of sabotage or even expression of contempt or anything else. They were strictly obedient, you know. And there was one incident, we took a small village, and I was sitting in this house, and this kid had a kid, Klein, from Brooklyn, that spoke Yiddish, so I was a little German. He brings this guy in who looks like he's going to a funeral, which he was. He wanted to see an officer. Well, officers in the Army didn't look like officers. We made a point not to, you know, insignia, no nothing. German officers, when we captured them, they would look like on parade, you know, they were impeccable. So he told him, he's an officer, he says something. I said, what do you don't want to see an Unterofficer, he don't want to see what is he, a real officer? I said, he didn't tell me what he wants to go to hell. He wanted the privilege of burying somebody. I'll bury them all, I wouldn't get. Another incident, one of my favorite stories is, we made an attack across this open field into a wood thing, and there were about 100 of us, and we knew there was somebody there, but we didn't know how many or who, and we attacked, and we got in close, and they waved white handkerchiefs, the flag, and something. We took about a dozen prisoners, and they were old men, honestly. They must have all been over 50. So I asked this kid, why did you shoot at us? And I said, what do you say? The SS made us shoot at you. Where's the SS? They left yesterday. That's the German mentality for me. It's disgusting, you know. The authority, you have the authority. Well, to move on, I got a lucky break. When I went back to the division, they'd filled up the replacements, and they sent me to France. They were opening up these camps, Camp Washington, Camp Philadelphia. So the purpose was to process all of the units that were going to go home or go to Japan. And there was a colonel there, interviewed me after the other one was going to let me be an athletic officer. So he noticed I had a year and a half at the Wharton School, so now I'm a PX officer. So I ran PXs for 6 months. We were doing about $300,000 a month, but I thought I did pretty good. For a while I had a captain in charge after I got him set up. Then he got sent home, so I was in charge again. I got to the damn camp, and there was a tent there, had a little stick in the ground, said camp headquarters, and I reported to this colonel, a really fine officer, McLaughlin. He was a combat officer. This unit, it was an infantry unit, was going to be overhead for the post. He says, I suppose you know your job, Lieutenant. I didn't know nothing. Yes, sir. So he said, well, these people haven't had any supplies for 6, 7 weeks, so get them something. So, excuse me, we got till 12:30.
You've got time. You've got 20 minutes.
20 minutes? So, well, I'll try and push it. I told the engineers they were supposed to have a bunch of buildings for me. He laughed at me. He said, we don't have a place for these people to sleep or latrines yet. So they gave me 5 good sergeants. I think it was 5, and these people all had some experience in running supermarkets or something. So at a meeting, I said, I tell you what, the engineers had a German ordnance, a depot there with a lot of lumber and everything. I said, you go to every unit in the post and collect all the tools you can find. And he comes back with a Jeep load full of them. I tell them they're not going to get them back, you know. So then I got a bunch of PWs. We had a PW camp there. Carpenters volunteered, and we built counters and shelves and everything else and put them in the tent, and we opened that darn PX. I got a picture here of me sitting on a mountain of PX supplies, and the first thing I tell you in Army Exchange, no credit. Well, I didn't have a safe, I didn't put the money, nothing. So I told a sergeant to call all the units on the post and tell them to send an officer with a certified list of his people and the ration cards, and pick up the stuff, and then go home, collect the money, and hold it till I called him. Well, in another 3 or 4 days, we had a finance officer, and he could take the money from us. So that worked out pretty good. So we got in business pretty good, and I stayed there for 6 months, and then I got another lucky break. I couldn't get home. I didn't have enough points. And there was a personnel officer named Danny Burke, who moved to Atlanta later. I met him here. He kept the Jewish boys in France, and the others go back to Germany. So he assigned me a quartermaster, about which I knew absolutely nothing. But this was the main base outside of Germany. We had responsibility for everything from North Africa to England and everything else. My job was to keep charts on all of this stuff. I had a couple of interesting incidents. One of them, I'm sitting at my desk one Saturday afternoon when I shouldn't have been there, and the colonel comes in with a telegram down through channels, General Clay, so forth. Senator Meade had gone to Frankfurt, and he was the chairman of the Army Surplus Committee, to decide what to do with all the junk we had accumulated there. He says, it's as simply, what's the value of all the organized supplies under your command? I'm a lieutenant in the infantry, and I'm supposed to know. So all we had a tonnage, which I'm sure was not anywhere near accurate, by various categories, like class 1 was what you eat, class 2 and 4, equipage, and class 3 was fuel or something. The sergeant and I started looking at each other, and he was a good typist. We started making up numbers. We knew it took 55 cents a day to feed a man, so class 1 was easy. And class 2 and 4 was, we know whether tent pegs or helmets or clothes or what they were. I said, seem to me cotton is worth so much, and we'll take double that figure and we'll use the number. And so far as fuel was concerned, we don't know whether it's aviation gasoline, what was solid or liquid. It seemed to me mother used to pay $8 a ton for coal when we had a coal furnace in the house. So we made up numbers. We get through, I got a figure like $4 billion, some odd $100 million. And Senator Meade takes it to Eisenhower. This is where your government is right. He takes it to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower and Senator Meade has a press conference Monday morning, and that's my number on page 1 of the Paris Herald Tribune, along with a number for Ordnance and Signal Corps and so forth. So anyway, what do you do with it? You know, then they had a problem. They had an ordnance depot. The ordnance depot was stacks of ammunition about the size of this room on the main highway between Brussels and Paris. And the French wanted to get rid of it. The Belgians wanted to get it's really a problem, you know? So I go to, the colonel sends me to a meeting, because I'm the guy that didn't know anything, and I had the time. And I'm sitting there listening, and so I figured, we'll take these German PW volunteers, we'll dismantle all this stuff, and they'll make fertilizer out of the nitrate powder, and they'll save the brass and the wooden crates, they need kindling it. That didn't work. It would have taken them 4,000 years to do this, and besides, they blew themselves up. So somebody else had a better idea. We got thousands of trucks, and we got all these landing craft. So they put all this ammunition that they weren't going to use. But before that, transportation reported back that if the French had given us all of their transportation facilities plus, it would take 2 years to move this junk into Germany. So they found a better solution. They put it on trucks, put the trunks on the ships, took the ships up in the North Sea and sunk them. That's the scuttlebutt I got. That was a story I heard, and I think it's probably true, you know. So, yeah.
What did you mean by not having enough points to go home?
Well, everybody got points for so many months overseas, and so if you were injured, you got an extra 5 points in combat and so forth. But officers needed twice as many points as the enlisted men. So I got over there in March, and don't forget that was very, very late in the war. But by the time I was there, all the established units were already there. So I couldn't get home. And anyway, I had this quartermaster job until I did come home in June or July of '46. One other incident, I got a letter from my father that some remnant of the family, Rella Sloman, do you know her?
Yeah, no,
Yep.
he is.
She and her brother, she was 16 or 17 now, I guess. Her brother was 20, and her mother had survived the Holocaust. How, I'm not sure. In fact, she told me later that when the Russians were coming in and the Germans made a move, and if they fell out, they'd shoot them. She said, the only thing that kept her alive, somebody threw them a jar of preserves. It gave them enough strength to go 1 more day or 2 more days or whatever. And I got a weekend leave, and I went over to Munich, and she was in a hospital. She had tuberculosis, and they put her in a tuberculosis. Her mother was working in the kitchen, and her brother was simply being supported in a room. And I was a PX officer at the time, so I knew I wanted to take him as much as I could. So I had a suitcase, backpack, and when I got the brother first, that was his name, I don't know. Anyway, and then we were going to go in this Jeep I had borrowed with an interpreter, and he had some German military boots and no socks. It never occurred to me to take socks. I don't know if I could have or not. Anyway, we went to the hospital, and I'll tell you, Dad tried for years to get him here, and he couldn't because of a tuberculosis. And I asked Rella one time, I said, how did you finally get? He says, Harold, the last x-ray pictures they saw in my file were not my x-rays. So they learned their ropes. They had survived. But that's another story. And our picture of them, when I saw them, is in the Bremen Museum there. We had a picture taken there. Well, I guess that covers most of my experiences. You know, I came home, and the first few months I really didn't know what to do with myself. I hung around the business, and I went to the Sugar Bowl with some friends from Penn, and on New Year's, and then I'd sort of decided before. I went back to school in February of '47, and finally graduated in February of '48. The important thing was my dad had bought me a car when I got home. That was my pride and joy. And so then I met Janie at Penn and lived happily ever after. So I don't really feel that the combat experience had made a lot of difference to me. I wasn't there that long. I didn't bond with the guys like you see in the movies because I didn't know any of them, and it didn't hurt. It wasn't as personal. I think my experience with the black soldiers, and I told you another experience I had when I was in Paris. I go to the officers club, and I was invited to play bridge with this Negro who happened to be a Harvard law graduate. He was a major. He didn't fit my stereotype at all, you know. And I think I read some of the letters, and my references are just awful, you know. My orientation toward black people, and it occurred to me since, and I was told since, one of the problems in the South is we never knew an educated black person. There was a complete schism. The only black people we knew were yard men and bootblacks and maids, servants, and so forth. We never knew black people that could read and write. So my experience with black people in the Army, I think, had a big influence on me. And the other big influence, I think, was being given jobs where you had a responsibility that you wouldn't have had for 10 or 15 or 20 years later if you hadn't. I was 22 years old when I was running this $3 million a year business, which at that time was a big business, you know. And there was nobody to answer to. The buck stopped there. I mean, for a while I had a captain in charge, and he left, and I've got about 70, 80 people, well, more like 150 people working for me, and it was my responsibility, and you just did it. And I must have violated more damn rules and regulations than you can shake a stick at. Yeah, one of the incidents I had might be of interest is, since I didn't have too much to do in the quartermaster, because I didn't know anything, they had orders, every unit had to write a history of its operation during the war. So the colonel assigned me that job, and I had access to all of the files. And I found a very interesting letter from General, what was his name? Nuts, the general at Bastogne, where he wrote a letter thanking the commanding officer of this unit I was in for supplying his people on a 12-hour notice to move into Bastogne and retain it and so forth. So I took all these papers out that had secret and confidential and everything else on them. I don't know, I guess they could have shot me for being a spy, but I had a British secretary I dictated the history to, and I got a nice letter about it. I had about 25 pages that I dictated and about 50 or 60 pages that I lifted out of the file and put in there. So every unit was supposed to do that, and that was, I had an interesting experience with that. So, are we through? Any questions?
One more. Were you in the Army when the atomic bomb was dropped?
Oh, yes.
What was the reaction?
Oh boy, we were the happiest guys you ever saw. Because I referred here constantly that we expected to go to Japan. We really did. And the question was, were we going to direct to do it in the Pacific, or were we going to come home first? And the units were, the rumors were that the units would come home and spend 30 days in the States before they went to Japan. So when that happened, there wasn't a dry eye in the plate. Everybody was very happy about it. And I found that the universal opinion, because what happened in the islands was so awful, you know, so brutal. And so we were happy to see it end. I guess I was.
Do you have any questions then? Thank you very much, and this will be filed in the Library of Congress and the Atlanta Historical Society. so you'll go down in history.